50 years ago, Saudi oil brought the world to its knees, and tonight, behind locked doors, the same kingdom just gambled everything on a new weapon, covering 1/3 of its desert with solar farms, a project aiming to erase carbon dioxide, disrupt energy markets, and crown Saudi Arabia the clean superpower of the century. But why would the world's oil giant risk its throne? And what happens if this solar shield actually works? In the autumn of 1973, a single decision in Riyadh sent shockwaves across continents. As OPEC ministers closed ranks and Saudi Arabia led the oil embargo, the world watched gas stations run dry from New York to London. Lines of cars stretched for blocks, tempers flared, and the price of crude quadrupled in just a few months. For the first time, Western economies faced the reality that energy was not just a commodity, but a weapon, one controlled by a handful of desert states. The term oil rent entered the global vocabulary, the vast unearned revenues pouring into Saudi coffers simply because the world could not function without its oil. That windfall built highways, skyscrapers, and entire cities seemingly overnight, but it also created a dependency so deep that policymakers compared it to an addiction. Energy security became a national obsession, driving everything from foreign policy to the design of family cars. Yet beneath the surface, the memory of those gas lines haunted both sides of the equation. For Saudi Arabia, the lesson was clear. Their power rested on the world's thirst for oil. But as decades passed and the threat of climate change grew, that foundation began to crack. The same logic that once made oil a source of strength now threatened to turn it into a liability. The addiction analogy took on new meaning as the world's push for decarbonization forced the kingdom to confront the risk of being left behind. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would demand a gamble even bigger than the embargo itself. The clock in Riyadh's government complex had just struck midnight when the cabinet doors closed. Inside, the country's most powerful figures faced a decision that would define a generation. For hours, ministers debated the financial, political, and existential risks of staking the nation's future on a solar gamble unlike any attempted before. The room was tense, voices low, as numbers flashed across digital displays, projections of gigawatts, export revenues, and the specter of a world moving beyond oil. Some officials warned of disaster if the plan failed. Others pressed for boldness, arguing that hesitation would mean irrelevance on the world stage. The breakthrough came with a single proposal, a sovereign guarantee. By pledging the full faith and credit of the Saudi state, the government would back every contract for solar panels, batteries, and transmission lines, removing any doubt for investors and suppliers. This was no incremental step. The first phase alone demanded a 50 gigawatt rollout, subject to a hard review before expanding further. The scale was staggering. No nation had ever attempted such a leap. Silence hung as the final statement echoed through the chamber. Never again will we hold our destiny hostage to a single export. With that, consensus broke the impasse. Pens scratched across documents, phones buzzed with coded instructions, and the machinery of government lurched into motion. On that night, Saudi Arabia crossed from ambition to action, binding itself to a plan that would test every limit of technology, finance, and national will. 1,000 kilometers north of Riyadh, the desert horizon bends under a new kind of pressure. Engineers from NEOM and their international partners have mapped out a grid that stretches beyond the mind's ability to picture. The numbers alone defy comparison. 500,000 square kilometers, an expanse greater than the entire surface area of Spain, earmarked for solar arrays and supporting infrastructure. Each gigawatt of power demands up to 3 square kilometers of panels, and the first phase targets 50 gigawatts. That means millions of photovoltaic modules, each one precision-aligned to chase the sun, forming a shimmering plane that swallows the sand. The blueprint calls for more than panels. Every 50 kilometers, a high-voltage direct current converter station rises from the dust, humming at voltages from 500 to 800 kilovolts. These installations act as the beating heart of the network, feeding electricity into transmission lines thick as a man's arm, running hundreds of kilometers toward distant coasts. The lines must be buried or elevated to withstand extreme heat and shifting dunes, with corridor widths that rival multi-lane highways. To service and monitor this web, maintenance roads crisscross the site, stretching for tens of thousands of kilometers. Modular substations dot the grid, each one a node in a system designed to handle surges, faults, and the relentless cycle of day and night. Battery storage facilities, some the size of city blocks, stand ready to absorb excess power and release it after sunset, smoothing out the desert's harsh rhythms. The logistics are staggering. At peak, over 100,000 workers will be housed in temporary cities, supplied by fleets of trucks ferrying in panels, steel, and electronics from ports on the Red Sea and Arabian Gulf. The procurement process alone involves global supply chains reaching from Chinese factories to European engineering firms. On paper, the plan is a marvel of modern ambition, a physical transformation on a scale no energy project has ever attempted. Every kilometer laid out in this grid represents not just a technical challenge, but a wager that the desert can be remade into the engine of a new world order. Sand moves with a force that no blueprint can tame. In the northern reaches of the grid, a sudden haboob can turn daylight into darkness within minutes, scouring exposed panels with abrasive dust. Engineers measure the aftermath in lost electrons. A single major sandstorm can slash output by up to 40%, as layers of fine grit scatter sunlight and clog moving parts. At pilot sites near Tabuk, teams have logged weeks of reduced generation after such storms, with automated cleaning robots struggling to keep pace. Routine maintenance, once a monthly chore, becomes a daily battle. Each square meter of panel demands up to 2 liters of water per week to stay clear. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of panels, and the numbers strain belief. For every 100 gigawatts of installed capacity, cleaning alone would consume nearly 500 million liters of water each week. In a country where every drop is precious, managers debate whether to truck in desalinated water from the Red Sea or invest in costly recycling systems. The logistical puzzle grows as the grid expands, with access roads stretching for thousands of kilometers and maintenance crews racing against the next dust front. Panel degradation is not just a theoretical risk. At a prototype field outside Najran, engineers recorded a 20% efficiency loss after a single storm season, prompting emergency reviews of anti-soiling coatings and robotic brush designs. The financial toll is measured in lost revenue and accelerated replacement cycles, with insurance premiums rising as underwriters factor in the relentless assault of sand and heat. Resource strain extends beyond water and manpower. Spare parts stockpiles must grow to match the scale of the network, and every outage risks cascading disruptions across the grid. The sheer fragility of the system, exposed by the desert's volatility, haunts project planners. Each operational setback is a reminder that the solar shield's promise rests on a foundation far more vulnerable than its architects once imagined. Across the northern desert, the first solar arrays begin to cast a new kind of shadow, one that reaches far beyond the shimmering panels themselves. Scientists from King Abdullah University and international research consortia track the numbers with a mixture of awe and caution. When sunlight hits a sea of photovoltaic cells, the desert's natural reflectivity, its albedo, drops sharply. Sand, with its pale surface, once bounced a third of the sun's energy back into the sky. Dark solar panels absorb much more, pulling that energy down into the ground and the grid. Peer-reviewed models, drawing on data from the Sahara and Chinese desert projects, predict a local surface warming of around 1.5 degrees Celsius where panels blanket the land. This heat isn't just a number on a weather station, it stirs the air, drives updrafts, and shifts wind patterns. Some simulations published in Science and Nature suggest that this warming could strengthen convection currents, lowering surface air pressure and pulling in moisture-laden air from distant seas. The result? An unexpected rise in rainfall, sometimes up to 150% above baseline in modeled scenarios. For a country where every drop is measured, the promise of new rain is both tantalizing and fraught with uncertainty. But the climate doesn't operate in isolation. As the panels disrupt wind flows, they also reduce the movement of dust across the landscape. In the short term, this means less dust, less grit scouring the panels, and fewer sandstorms clouding the sky. Yet, dust from the Arabian and Saharan deserts has long traveled thousands of kilometers, fertilizing the Atlantic and even reaching the Amazon. Researchers warn that curbing this natural nutrient supply could have ripple effects on distant ecosystems, from ocean plankton to rainforest canopies. Beneath the panels, a microclimate takes hold. Shaded ground stays cooler, soil moisture rises, and hardy plants begin to reclaim stretches of what was once bare sand. Some ecologists see the potential for pockets of new life, while others worry about the loss of habitat for species adapted to the harshest conditions. The trade-offs complex. Every gigawatt of clean energy comes with a cascade of environmental feedbacks, some visible, others still unfolding in the models and field stations scattered across the desert. As the solar shield expands, the question is no longer just what it can power, but how it will reshape the land, the air, and the rhythms of life that have defined Arabia for millennia. In the empty quarter, where the lines of solar panels now stretch to the horizon, the ancient rhythms of desert life have been interrupted. Bedouin families, whose grazing routes once traced invisible paths across this land, find themselves at the center of a transformation they did not choose. Official statements frame the transition as a national triumph, but on the ground, the experience is far more complicated. Government representatives arrive with contracts and offers, cash payments calculated at 10,000 reals per hectare, promises of new homes, and, for some, replacement livestock. These terms are delivered with the language of progress, yet elders recall meetings where the presence of security forces made refusal feel impossible. Rights groups attempting to document the process report challenges in gaining access, and their findings remain fragmentary. In interviews, several tribal leaders describe a sense of resignation rather than consent. One, speaking on condition of anonymity, recounts the pressure to sign away hereditary grazing rights, an act that severs not only land, but lineage. The official narrative emphasizes opportunity, yet the reality for many is a forced recalibration of identity and livelihood. Inside the project offices, a different kind of dissent surfaces. An engineer, whose name does not appear in any press release, compiles internal memos warning of overlooked safety risks and the social fallout brewing beyond the perimeter fence. These warnings circulate quietly, never reaching the public, but their existence is an open secret among staff. The solar shield's promise of national renewal comes at a cost measured not just in hectares, but in the quiet dislocation of those who once called the desert home. From the moment the first gigawatts began to flow out of the desert, energy analysts at the International Energy Agency and the International Renewable Energy Agency started to issue warnings. The numbers were impossible to ignore. NEOM's hydrogen complex alone was ramping up to 650 tons per day, with expansion plans that would put Saudi Arabia at the center of a new global supply chain. European and Japanese governments, having pledged net zero targets, quietly circulated contingency papers. Their ministers remembered the lessons of the oil embargo and now saw a different kind of dependency looming. This time, not on oil, but on green hydrogen and clean electricity exported from the kingdom's solar fields. The scale of Saudi ambition began to draw comparisons to the original OPEC. Industry insiders spoke of an OPEC of renewables, a club of producers who could set prices and control flows of green ammonia and electricity, just as oil barons once did with crude. The prospect unsettled policymakers across the developed world. At closed-door energy summits, officials debated how to avoid becoming captive to a single supplier again. Some called for strategic reserves of hydrogen, others for rapid domestic buildouts, but the reality was stark. Saudi Arabia's cost advantage, driven by relentless sun, cheap land, and sovereign-backed contracts, made their exports nearly impossible to undercut. market forecasts began to shift. Spot prices for green hydrogen traded in Rotterdam and Yokohama started to track Saudi export announcements. Even the threat of coordinated supply cuts could send prices soaring, as analysts modeled scenarios eerily reminiscent of the 1970s. The world's energy future, once imagined as decentralized and resilient, now faced the specter of a new cartel, one built not on oil wells, but on the shimmering expanse of photovoltaic panels stretching across the Arabian sands. A new reality settles over the world's energy map. The same kingdom that once held the world hostage with oil now commands the pulse of clean power. European and Asian economies, racing toward net zero pledges, find themselves tethered to Saudi export schedules and contract terms. In Brussels, Tokyo, and Seoul, policymakers draft emergency protocols for hydrogen supply interruptions, knowing that a single export pause could send prices spiking across continents. Spot markets for green hydrogen and ammonia react to every Saudi announcement, while rival producers scramble to match the kingdom's cost advantage, and few succeed. Diplomatic leverage shifts in ways that recall the darkest days of the 1970s embargo, but the weapon is different. Instead of tankers idling offshore, it's grid interconnectors and ammonia tank farms that become bargaining chips. Nations that once dictated energy policy through fossil reserves now negotiate for access to clean Saudi electrons and molecules. The calculus of alliances, sanctions, and trade agreements bends around this new axis. Energy security, long imagined as a problem solved by diversification, becomes a fresh source of anxiety. No matter how many wind farms or battery arrays are built elsewhere, the sheer scale and efficiency of the Saudi solar shield makes it the backbone of global decarbonization. Governments debate strategic reserves of hydrogen, but the infrastructure to store and distribute it at scale still lags behind. For decades, the world's energy future was shaped by the fear of scarcity. Now it is shaped by the concentration of abundance, a single supplier with the capacity to tip markets, steer climate progress, and redraw the boundaries of power. The balance that once hinged on oil now rests on sunlight captured in the desert, and every nation must rethink what it means to be secure in a world remade by the solar shield. Today, the world's energy axis tilts toward the desert. As Saudi solar grids expand, every nation faces a new reality. The path to climate stability may run through Riyadh. The kingdom's gamble forces allies and rivals alike to rethink power, dependence, and ambition. The question now is not who controls oil, but who controls the sun.